Random thoughts. Today's video is kind of like a follow-up to a video that I did, the previous video that is. And in today's video, I'm going to talk about something that is often not talked about. And it's also something or a fact about history that is almost always ignored. And it is an example of how history is often so simplified that very critical details are lost. Because when we read history, we just think of history, especially if we think of the past, let's say 100 years and going back, and especially we think about the race relationships, then we just think that it was just blacks and whites and that's how everything worked and there was no intermingling, which is not actually very true. Of course, there is a section in history and it's not everywhere in the world where there was such a separation of the races, but it has not been like that throughout human history. Humans have intermingled. Genetic composition of people we see today, we cannot be so sure that it's pure anything. It can't be pure anything. Now, yesterday I talked about this guy who went by the name of Abram Petrovich Gannibal. I didn't mention his name, but I mentioned the name of his great-grandson, Alexander Pushkin. Now, Alexander Pushkin is somebody who is well known as being what many consider him to be the father of modern Russian literature and one of the greatest poets to ever live. Now, Alexander Pushkin, his great-grandfather was an African. He was someone who was captured from Africa, taken to the Ottoman Empire, and then sold over to Russia, and he became, we can say, a servant of Sir Peter the Great. And Sir Peter the Great ended up liking him so much that he stopped looking at him as a servant and started treating him as his son. And in fact, he paid for his education. And Abram Petrovich Gannibal, that's what he came to be known by, went and studied in France, and he came back to Russia, and he was given a very high rank in the military. He became the chief military engineer of the Russian army, and he was a general-in-chief, and he retired a very successful man. He retired very wealthy, and we are told he had a huge estate, and indeed he did own his own slaves, and we are told that I've read somewhere that most of them were indeed white, not black. That again tells us how history can be so confusing, and sometimes we've just taken the simplified history. I often say that history is sometimes simplified to absurdity, or it's simplified to be so far from what was actually happening. Now, it turns out Abram Petrovich Gannibal, besides of course being the great-grandfather of Alexander Pushkin, has many descendants who are well known today. And in fact, we are told that many of the British aristocrats are descendants of this guy. And in fact, one of them is even a cousin of Queen Elizabeth, the monarch who just passed not long ago. I did mention that Abraham Petrovich Gannibal married the first wife, but then there were issues in that marriage, and that's because the first wife was forced to marry him, and seems like she had an issue with how he looked and she didn't want to have kids with him, and in fact she cheated on him and became pregnant for another man. And when Abram Petrovich Gannibal found out, sent her away. In fact, he did not divorce her immediately. He just sent her away, and he started living with another woman. They were not married for a while. In fact, they did not marry, until they had some kids. This second wife came from a noble family in the Scandinavia. She came from a very well-respected family in the Scandinavia, and she became his wife, and they ended up having 10 kids, a lot of kids. Now, it's out of these 10 kids that we have so many descendants spread across Europe, and most of them ended up becoming aristocratic. And what that means is they ended up marrying into very high-placed families or high-class families, including in the United Kingdom. And that's how we end up with so many aristocrats in the UK being descendants of Abram Petrovich Gannibal. Now, I need to talk about something that I didn't talk about in the previous video, and that is the origins of Gannibal. Now, in that video, I said he came from Ethiopia, but that is so simplified. Again, it's history. We've simplified history to to the extent that we miss out some critical details. Now, he himself said that he came from a place called Logon. Now, that leaves a lot of confusion because turns out there is Logon in what we know today as Eritrea. But there is also another Logon, which is a place that was part of the Kotoko Empire in the northern part of Cameroon, what we know today as Cameroon. Of course, Cameroon did not exist then. A place south of Lake Chad, the southern part or that region. And there was a sultanate or an empire that existed there for a while. And many historians have come to conclude that it's likely that's what he was talking about when he said, I come from Logon, and not the Logon in Eritrea. But we will never know for sure what he meant by saying, I come from Logon. One thing that makes Ethiopia, of course, including Eritrea, Ethiopia is a modern state, is that it makes sense that he came from that region or the Horn of Africa, because during this time, the Ottoman Turks had a lot of influence in the Horn of Africa, and they used to explore that region a lot, and therefore it makes sense that likely that's where he came from, because it is them. There is no dispute that it is the Ottomans who took him to Constantinople, and then he was, of course, taken to Russia. So the fact that it is the Ottoman Turks who took him makes it make sense that, or it makes it possible or highly possible that he came from the Horn of Africa. But also, when we talk of Ethiopia, the name Ethiopia has been used in history, not the way we are using it today. Of course, today when you say Ethiopia, everybody thinks of the state of Ethiopia that we have today in the Horn of Africa. But when you read ancient texts, including some that I've mentioned in videos that I've recorded, for example, Herodotus talks of Ethiopia, but when they talk of Ethiopia in ancient texts, they don't actually mean the Ethiopia we know today. Ethiopia used to be a word that was used for all of Africa. Basically, all of Africa, southern of Egypt, was basically Ethiopia. So it's possible when he said, I come from Logon, Ethiopia, he meant I come from Logon, Africa, which could be its Logon in Cameroon, northern Cameroon. So, but we never know for sure. But what is for sure is that he existed. He was taken as a slave from Africa, and he was sold to become a servant of Sir Peter the Great. And he did study military in France, and he did become a high-ranking military officer in Russia. And he did marry into, we can say, royalty. And his descendants do exist today, and many of them do acknowledge that he is their ancestor. Some of the aristocrats in the UK that are descendants of Abram Gannibal include one Natalia Grosvenor, Duchess of Westminster. There is also Alexandra Hamilton, Duchess of Abercorn. There is Hugh Grosvenor, 7th Duke of Westminster. There is George Mountbatten, 4th Marquis of Milford Haven, who is a cousin of Queen Elizabeth. There is also Nadejda Mountbatten, Marchioness of Milford Haven. So those are some of the aristocrats from the UK who are descendants of Abram Gannibal. The debate about where he exactly came from in Africa, that's going to be an ongoing debate. We might never know for sure, but it's likely what we know today as Eritrea, or used to be part of Ethiopia. Or likely it's Ethiopia, Africa, and that means it's likely it's northern part of Cameroon, or could be anywhere in Africa, really. We will never know for sure. Those are my random thoughts.